Fleet Master, this is your final warning. Turn back now.
Your border is imaginary, human.
Boundary breach detected. Aegis grid awake.
Broadcasting into the dead black of the Oort cloud, a warning loop echoed in 64 languages. Turn back. It wasn't a threat, but a plea. Yet, the Kandharan armada burned straight through the boundary line anyway. 30 seconds later, the largest fleet in the quadrant simply ceased to exist. The air in Outpost 44 tasted like licking a 9-volt battery. It always did. Gideon Hayes sat slumped in an ergonomic chair that had lost its ergonomics sometime during the last decade, staring at the primary telemetry feed. He rubbed his thumb across his jaw, listening to the dry, scratchy sound of his own 3-day stubble. His uniform collar was damp with sweat at the back of his neck, itching furiously against his skin. The station's environmental controls had been stuck on a tepid, humid setting for a month, leaving the small command center smelling vaguely of old gym socks and burnt ozone. He took a sip from his mug. The synthetic coffee was sludgy, room temperature, and coated the back of his throat with a bitter film. He swallowed hard, grimacing. Ping. The sound was soft, unobtrusive, just a gentle chime from the primary long-range deep scan array. Gideon blinked heavily. His eyes felt as though they were full of sand. He leaned forward, the joints of his chair screaming in protest, and tapped a sequence into the sticky, battered glass of the console. The screen flickered a hardware issue he'd logged 12 times to Earth Command, only to be ignored before resolving into a tactical topographical map of the Sol system's outer edge. Beyond the Kuiper Belt, past the scattered, icy rocks of the Dark Zone, red dots. Not 1, not 10. Gideon stopped chewing on the inside of his cheek. He dragged a heavy hand down his face, feeling the cold, clammy sweat beginning to prickle across his forehead. He tapped the screen again, zooming in on the telemetry data. 412 signatures. Massive ones. Capital ships, dreadnoughts, carrier escorts. They were moving in a tight, disciplined wedge formation, burning hard toward the invisible line that humanity had drawn in the void. "Damn it," Gideon whispered. His voice was raspy, unused. He hadn't spoken out loud in 3 days. He keyed the comms link to Earth Command. Outpost 44 to Central. We have a code black on the perimeter. Sector J9. There was a hiss of static, followed by the bored, nasal voice of Supervisor Walker. "Copy, 44. We see them. The Kandharan hegemony. They've been posturing for a standard year. They aren't posturing, Walker. They're burning at 0.2 light speed. They are 90 minutes from the demarcation line. Protocol dictates you initiate the automated deterrence broadcast, Hayes. Do your job. Central out." The line went dead. Gideon stared at the console. He hated Walker. He hated Earth Command. Mostly, though, he hated the red dots on his screen. Humanity didn't have a standing fleet guarding the border. They didn't have patrol cruisers or grand, shining armadas. Earth had spent the last 2 centuries exhausted by war, nearly destroying itself 3 times over. When they finally clawed their way out of their own gravity, well, they had zero interest in fighting anyone else. But they knew the galaxy was full of predators. So they built the line. Gideon's fingers hovered over the red, physical button on the far right of the console. The plastic was worn smooth from the thumbs of the operators who had sat here before him. He pressed it down. A mechanical clunk echoed somewhere in the bowels of the station as the high-gain transmitters powered up. The hum of the cooling fans kicked into overdrive, vibrating through the metal floorboards and into the soles of Gideon's boots. "Broadcasting," he muttered to himself. Out in the black, a looped transmission began to fire on every known open frequency, cycling through 64 different galactic dialects. The message was audio, visual, and mathematical. It was spoken by a calm, synthesized human voice. "Attention. You are approaching the Sol system demarcation line. We claim no territory beyond this point, and we hold no malice toward your people. However, crossing this coordinate is an act of war. We do not engage in conventional naval combat. If you cross the line, You will be destroyed. This is your only warning. Turn back. It wasn't a boast. It lacked the theatricality of alien warlords screaming about honor and blood. It was a polite, bureaucratic statement of fact. Gideon watched the screen. The red dots didn't slow down. They didn't alter course. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The smell of the stale air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on his chest. His stomach churned, a sour, acidic bubble rising in his throat. He reached into his chest pocket, pulling out a battered pack of nicotine patches. His hands were shaking, just a slight tremor in his fingers, but enough to make peeling the backing off the patch a frustrating chore. He slapped it onto the side of his neck, waiting for the chemical bite. Ping. An incoming transmission, directed squarely at Outpost 44. Gideon exhaled slowly. He tapped the console to accept. The main holoscreen flared to life, casting a harsh, sickly blue light over Gideon's tired face. The image resolved into the bridge of a Kandahran dreadnought. The architecture was aggressive, all sweeping curves of dark, polished metal and glowing violet conduits. In the center stood the Kandahran fleetmaster. He was tall, clad in ceremonial armor that looked like obsidian glass. His skin was a mottled gray, his eyes 4 slits of burning yellow. When he spoke, the translation software on Gideon's console struggled for a second, clicking and popping before spitting out a heavily accented, mechanical English. Human outpost. This is Fleetmaster Korvath of the Kandahran hegemony. Turn off your automated noise. It is an insult to our sensors. Gideon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the console. Fleetmaster, you are on a direct intercept course with the Sol border. Alter your trajectory immediately. Korvath let out a sound that translated as a series of wet, clicking barks. Laughter. Your border is a fiction, human. We have scanned your system. You have no defensive fleets. You have no orbital platforms. You have nothing but this rusted tin can and a desperate audio recording. Turn around, Korvath, Gideon said. His voice wasn't heroic. It was flat, exhausted. You don't understand what you're flying into. It's not a bluff. The hegemony claims this sector by right of expansion. Korvath sneered. Your weak, pacifist species will surrender your core worlds by the end of the solar cycle. Prepare to be boarded. The transmission cut instantly. Gideon stared at the black screen. The reflection staring back at him was a middle-aged man with dark circles under his eyes, thinning hair, and a look of profound, helpless dread. He didn't want to watch them die. He really didn't. But they were 30 minutes from the line, and they weren't stopping. The silence in Outpost 44 was deafening. The only sounds were the rattling hum of the air recyclers and the erratic, heavy thump of Gideon's own heartbeat in his ears. He stood up from the console and began to pace. 3 steps to the bulkhead, turn, 3 steps back. The metal floor felt cold through his boots. He rubbed the back of his neck, right over the nicotine patch, his fingers digging into the tense muscles. On the central screen, the red wedge of the Kandahran fleet crept closer to the solid yellow boundary line. 20 minutes. Gideon's mind raced, a chaotic jumble of protocols and raw human panic. He was a comms tech, a glorified toll booth operator who had taken this post to escape a messy divorce and a mountain of gambling debt in the Martian colonies. He wasn't a soldier. He had never seen combat. The closest he'd come to death was a blown oxygen valve in Sector 4 2 years ago. And now, he was about to preside over the deaths of tens of thousands of sentient beings. He stopped pacing and slammed his fist against the wall. The dull thud offered no relief, only a sharp pain that radiated up his knuckles. Idiots, he hissed through clenched teeth. Arrogant, stupid idiots. He threw himself back into the chair, the springs whining loudly. He opened a direct channel to Earth Command again. Walker, you copy? I'm here, Hayes. Stop flooding the channel. Supervisor Walker sounded exactly as he always did, slightly annoyed, as if Gideon were interrupting his lunch. They aren't turning around. They think we're bluffing. The scan shows no military buildup, so they think the space is empty. The space is empty, Hayes. That's the point. Can we disable it? The Aegis grid. Just shut it down. Let them cross, and we can negotiate. If it fires, there's no walking this back. It's a massacre." There was a pause on the line. The static hissed, sounding like dry leaves on concrete. When Walker spoke again, the boredom was gone, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic steel. "Listen to me very carefully, Gideon. You do not touch the manual override. The Aegis grid was built for a reason. The moment we back down, the moment we let them cross without consequence, humanity is finished. We become a vassal state. You let the protocol run. There are 50,000 souls on those ships," Gideon yelled, spit flying onto the console glass. 50,000 people who think they're walking into an empty room. Then they should have read the sign on the door. "Do not contact me again until the threat is neutralized. Central out." Gideon stared at the dead channel. He felt sick. The sour taste of acid was back in his throat, burning his esophagus. He looked at the telemetry. 10 minutes. The Kondaron ships were magnificent, even rendered as wireframe models on a tactical display. They were massive, heavily armored, and projected energy shields that registered as bright violet halos on the spectrographs. Those shields could absorb sustained plasma bombardments and deflect high-energy laser fire. They were built for conventional war. But humanity didn't fight conventional wars anymore. Humanity had learned that energy shields were great against energy weapons. They were useless against basic, brutal mass. Gideon watched the countdown timer ticking away in the corner of his screen. 5 minutes. He pulled up the tactical feed for the Aegis grid. It was a network that stretched across millions of miles of empty space along the Oort cloud. To the Kondaran sensors, it looked like dust. Random, floating asteroids, dead rock, and ice. But buried inside those rocks were dormant, cold-sleep mass drivers. Railguns the size of skyscrapers, powered by localized fusion reactors that only woke up when the perimeter was breached. They didn't fire lasers. They fired tungsten carbide rods, each the size of a city bus, coated in stealth ablative plating. They fired them at 0.99 the speed of light. 2 minutes. Gideon's breath came in short, shallow gasps. He leaned over the console, his hands gripping the edges so hard his knuckles turned white. "Please," he whispered to the empty room. "Just stop the engines. Just look at the math. Stop the engines." He opened the broadcast channel one last time. He didn't use the automated voice. He spoke directly into the microphone. "Fleetmaster Korvath, this is Gideon Hayes. I am a human being. I am begging you, turn your ships around. If you cross that line, you will all die. There is no glory here. Just turn back." Static crackled. Then, Korvath's voice, dripping with contempt. "Die with dignity. Human. We cross in 30 seconds. Gideon closed his eyes. He couldn't watch, but the flashing light of the console demanded his attention. He opened his eyes, the harsh blue glare burning his retinas. 10 seconds. 9, 8. The leading tip of the Kondaran wedge, Korvath's massive dreadnought, touched the yellow boundary line on the screen. 3, 2, 1. The system chimed, a soft, pleasant ding, like a microwave, finishing a cycle. Text flashed in green across the top of Gideon's screen. "Boundary breach detected. Aegis grid awake." It didn't happen with a roar. There were no cinematic explosions, no dramatic shockwaves rolling through the void. In the vacuum of space, physics was a silent, unfeeling butcher. On Gideon's primary tactical screen, the Sol system perimeter lit up. For a fraction of a millisecond, the sensors flared blindingly white, completely overloading the optical filters. Gideon threw his arm over his eyes, turning his head away as the monitors in Outpost 44 screamed with data clipping errors. The station's power grid flickered, the lights dimming to a brownish yellow before the backup generators kicked in with a heavy, vibrating thrum. When he finally lowered his arm, squinting through the spots dancing in his vision, the telemetry was resetting. The Aegis grid had fired. Millions of miles away, dormant asteroids had split open like rotten fruit. Electromagnetic rails had surged with enough raw power to light up a continent, instantly accelerating millions of multi-ton tungsten rods to relativistic speeds. They crossed the dark expanse in a heartbeat, a perfectly calculated, cross-hatching net of kinetic devastation. The Kondaran energy shields, calibrated to deflect directed energy and plasma, didn't even register the kinetic slugs until it was over. At near light speed, a tungsten rod doesn't punch a hole in a ship. It transfers so much kinetic energy upon impact that it instantly vaporizes the armor, the hull, the atmosphere, and the crew, turning the entire vessel into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated plasma and shattered atoms. Gideon stared at the screen. The sweat on his neck felt cold. He was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that started in his chest and worked its way down to his knees. The 412 red dots were gone. There were no distress signals, no escape pods launching, no frantic, screaming chatter on the open comms channels, just static. A low, hissing wall of white noise. Gideon swallowed, but his mouth was completely dry. He tasted ash and copper. He pushed his chair back, the wheels catching on a dent in the floorboards. He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of water, and stumbled toward the small waste bin tucked in the corner of the room. He dropped to his knees, gripping the rim of the metal bin, and retched. His stomach heaved violently, expelling the sour synthetic coffee and bile. He coughed, spitting strings of saliva, his eyes watering profusely. The smell of his own vomit mixed with the ozone and the stale air of the cabin, making him gag again. He stayed on his knees for a long time, the cold metal of the floor pressing against his shins. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the tactical map. But the absence of those red dots was burned into the back of his eyelids. 50,000 people. Erased. Deleted from the universe in the time it took to blink. No grand battle. No heroic last stand. Just a mathematical equation executed flawlessly by cold, unthinking machinery. Ping. The sound from the console made Gideon flinch as if he'd been struck. He wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, taking a deep, shuddering breath, and hauled himself back onto his feet. He swayed slightly as he walked back to the command desk. The screen displayed a green, flashing notification. Threat neutralized. Grid returning to dormant state. Below that, a secondary sensor sweep was updating. The space where the mighty Khandaran Armada had been a minute ago was now a spreading, diffuse cloud of microscopic debris and rapidly cooling gases. A graveyard of dust. The comms channel crackled. Outpost 44. This is Central. Acknowledge telemetry. Supervisor Walker's voice. It was perfectly level, unbothered. He might as well have been asking Gideon to confirm a shipment of spare parts. Gideon stared at the microphone. He hated the voice that came out of his own mouth. It sounded hollow. Dead. Outpost 44 acknowledges, Gideon said, leaning heavily on the console. Target. Target is neutralized. The space is clear. Understood. 44. Log the event in the shift report. Central out. The connection severed. Gideon stood alone in the dim light of the outpost. The hum of the cooling fans droned on, indifferent to the slaughter. He looked out the small, reinforced plasteel viewport into the infinite, uncaring black of the Oort cloud. It looked exactly as it had an hour ago, quiet, empty. He reached up, peeled the nicotine patch off his neck, and threw it into the trash. It wasn't helping anyway. He sat back down in his broken chair, the silence pressing against his eardrums, and waited for his shift to end. 2 hours after the Khandaran Armada was reduced to a smear of radioactive dust, Gideon's console pinged with an incoming file transfer. It wasn't a damage assessment. It wasn't a psychological wellness check. It was a Form 88B, expenditure of automated munitions and post-incident debris logging. Gideon stared at the glowing blue document. His cursor blinked steadily in the first empty field, demanding his digital signature. He rubbed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms hard against his orbital bones until bursts of colorful static flared in his vision. His head throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache pulsing right behind his temples. The station's environmental system rattled overhead, spitting a lukewarm breeze across his face that smelled faintly of copper and old dust. He reached for his water bottle, unscrewing the cap with numb fingers. The water was stale, carrying the plastic tang of the reservoir tank, but he drank it in greedy gulps to wash away the lingering burn of bile in his throat. Form 88B, Gideon whispered. his voice cracking in the empty room. Right. Paperwork. He dragged the heavy touchscreen closer. Estimated munitions expended. He didn't know. The system fired autonomously. He typed, classified, hostile, tonnage, destroyed. He had to calculate that. He pulled up the pre-strike telemetry, his stomach performing a slow, sickening roll as the wireframe models of the Khandaran dreadnoughts reappeared on his secondary monitor. He punched the rough dimensions into the estimator. It spit out a number with too many zeros. He copied and pasted it. Ping. The comms channel crackled, overriding his local mute setting. The primary holo projector whined, the cooling fan struggling as a high-resolution, three-dimensional bust of General Caldwell flickered into existence. Caldwell sat in a leather-backed chair in a brightly lit office somewhere in Geneva. His uniform was crisp, the dark fabric immaculately pressed, adorned with rows of subdued commendation ribbons. He looked like a man who slept a full 8 hours every night and drank coffee made from actual beans. "Hayes, excellent work," Caldwell said. His voice was smooth, carrying the warm, resonant timbre of a politician. "I'm reviewing the telemetry logs now. A completely clean sweep. The Aegis grid operated at 100% efficiency. You held your nerve perfectly." Gideon stopped typing. He looked at the projection, taking in the clean-shaven jaw and the relaxed posture of the general. "I didn't do anything, General," Gideon said. His voice was flat, devoid of the respect the rank demanded. "I just watched. A machine did it." Caldwell offered a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You managed the protocol. You observed the demarcation line. A lesser operator might have panicked, might have tried to initiate a manual override, fearing the political fallout. You followed the doctrine. Earth Command recognizes that." Gideon let out a short, harsh breath through his nose. 50,000 people, Caldwell, give or take. They're just gone. We didn't even try to disable their engines. We didn't fire a warning shot. The broadcast was the warning. "Hayes," Caldwell said, the warmth instantly draining from his tone, replaced by an icy pragmatism. "We do not have the manpower to board ships. We do not have the infrastructure to take 50,000 prisoners of war. If we disable their engines, they become a siege risk on our border. If we negotiate, we show weakness. The Khandarans are apex predators. You don't ask a wolf to sit nicely. You shoot it before it reaches the fence." "They thought the space was empty," Gideon argued, his hands gripping the edge of the console. The plastic creaked under the pressure. "They thought we were weak because they couldn't see our guns. And now the entire quadrant knows exactly what happens when you cross the saw line," Caldwell replied calmly. "The debris field will act as a permanent navigational hazard and a monument. The hegemony won't send another fleet. Neither will the Volok or the syndicates. You just secured peace for the next 100 years, Gideon. Fill out your 88B. Take a mild sedative from the med kit. Your relief shuttle will arrive in 2 weeks." The projection collapsed into a single point of light and vanished, plunging the command center back into its dim, sickly blue glow. Peace. Gideon let the word roll around in his mind. It felt greasy. Humanity hadn't evolved past war. They had just industrialized the slaughter so completely that it didn't look like war anymore. It looked like waste management. They were the apex predators now, hiding in the dark, laying bear traps in the tall grass and pretending it was an act of civilized defense. He turned back to the touchscreen. Summary of threat neutralization. Gideon's fingers hovered over the glass. He stared at the blank white box. Before he could type a single character, a low, warbling alarm broke the silence. It wasn't the harsh blare of the perimeter breach alarm. It was a localized, passive sensor ping. Gideon frowned. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and dragged the sensor overlay to his primary monitor. The Aegis grid had powered down. The millions of railguns were back to sleep, masquerading as cold, dead rocks in the Oort cloud. The area where the fleet had been was just a massive, expanding cloud of superheated gas and microscopic shrapnel. But deep within that cloud, something was moving. Gideon tapped the screen, isolating the signal. It was faint, extremely faint. A tiny thermal bloom, erratic and fluctuating. buried under the massive radiation spikes of the destroyed fleet. He keyed up the magnification, running the data through the station's imaging filters. It took 30 seconds for the computer to stitch together a coherent picture through the thick dust. When the image finally resolved, Gideon felt all the air leave his lungs. It was a chunk of hull, a jagged, torn piece of Condorron metal, maybe the size of a commercial transport shuttle. It was spinning slowly, tumbling end over end in the silent vacuum. But it wasn't just scrap. There was a faint, violet glow bleeding from a damaged bulkhead, an emergency environmental shield. It was flickering, desperately trying to maintain a bubble of atmosphere in a ruined compartment. Gideon checked the telemetry. The chunk was drifting. It had been knocked backward by the kinetic impacts, but its current trajectory was slowly, inevitably, drifting back toward the Sol system boundary line. There were life signs, faint, fading, but present. 3 distinct biological rhythms inside that flickering violet bubble. Gideon stared at the thermal readouts. 3 survivors out of 50,000. 3 Condorrons, trapped in a metal coffin, freezing to death in the dark, drifting blindly toward a border that had just annihilated their entire civilization's armada. Ping. Supervisor Walker. The text prompt appeared in the corner of Gideon's screen. Walker, Hayes. Central is seeing a thermal anomaly in Sector J9. Residual debris? Gideon's hands hovered over the keyboard. If he confirmed it was a surviving compartment, protocol was absolute. The Aegis grid didn't do partial jobs. If that chunk of hull crossed the yellow line, even by a millimeter, the localized automated turrets would wake up and vaporize it. Earth Command wouldn't send a rescue team. They would let it burn. He looked at the 3 faint, rhythmic pulses on his screen. Hearts. Alien hearts, maybe, but hearts nonetheless, beating in terror. Gideon swallowed hard. The sour taste was gone. Now, there was just an arid, choking dryness in his throat. He placed his fingers on the keyboard. Hayes. Confirmed, Central. Just a secondary plasma fire venting from a destroyed reactor core. No structural integrity. Walker. Understood. Log it and scrub the grid. Shift is over in 3 hours. Gideon closed the chat window. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in jerky, uneven movements. He had just lied to Earth Command. If they ran a deep diagnostic on his sensor logs, they would see the biologicals. He would be court-martialed. He would spend the rest of his life in a penal colony on Europa. But as he looked at the 3 flickering lights on his screen, Gideon found that he simply didn't care. The chunk of Condorron hull was exactly 19 minutes and 40 seconds away from drifting back across the Sol boundary line. Gideon didn't leap into action with the crisp efficiency of a hero. Instead, he simply stared at the telemetry, his brain stalling out, grinding its gears against the sheer absurdity of what he was about to do. He dragged his hands down his face, his fingernails scraping against his heavy stubble. The friction sounded loud in the cramped, humid air of the command center. He couldn't send a tractor beam. Outpost 44 was a listening post, not a shipyard. It didn't possess one. He couldn't launch a rescue skiff. The only ship clamped to the external airlock was his automated return shuttle, an unpressurized metal tube barely big enough for 1 human and a duffel bag. Think, damn it, think, Gideon muttered. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a hot, itchy path down his temple, before stinging the corner of his right eye. He blinked furiously, his vision blurring. If that scrap of metal crossed the yellow line, Aegis would kill it. The system was hard-coded, buried under layers of Earth Command encryption, designed specifically to prevent local operators from suffering sudden bouts of morality. He couldn't shut the guns off, but he could lie to them. Gideon slammed his hands onto the sticky glass of the console, wincing as his sore joints popped. He pulled up the localized targeting parameters for Sector J9. The code cascaded across his secondary monitor, a dense, hostile labyrinth of automated threat assessment algorithms and military-grade firewalls. Gideon wasn't a software engineer. He was a burnt-out comms tech whose greatest technical achievement in the last 5 years was writing a backdoor script to pirate the Martian Gravball playoffs without paying the orbital broadcast fee. He was going to use that exact same script to bypass the most lethal defense grid in human history. His fingers slipped on the slick glass keyboard interface. He cursed, wiping his palms frantically against the rough fabric of his uniform trousers. He isolated the thermal bloom of the Condorcet hull, feeling a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. 3 faint heartbeats. Slower now. The violent purple glow of their emergency shield was guttering like a candle in a draft. He opened a port into the local Aegis sensor buoy network. The terminal immediately flashed a warning, painting his face in a harsh, angry amber light. Unauthorized access detected. Initiating protocol lockout. No. Shut up, Gideon hissed through his teeth. He hammered the override command, patching in his old pirate script. He didn't try to shut the buoy down. He just fed it garbage data. He wrote a localized masking override, telling the Aegis targeting matrix that the specific mass, trajectory, and thermal signature of the drifting hull was nothing more than a Class 4 silicate asteroid. A dead, cold rock. He hit execute. A progress bar materialized on the screen. It didn't flash or ping. It crawled. Bafenjashar. On the primary monitor, the wireframe representation of the hull drifted inexorably closer to the glowing boundary line. 12 minutes. The violent shudder of the station's environmental recyclers seemed to sync with the erratic, thumping palpitations in Gideon's chest. The air in the room felt thick, tasting metallic and stale, like breathing through a dirty screen door. He leaned closer to the monitor, his breath fogging the glass. Accept the patch. Accept the damn patch. You stupid blind machine. 98%, 100%. The amber warning light blinked out. A green text box popped up, polite and indifferent. Masking script accepted. Target classified. Silicate debris. Gideon let out a breath that sounded like a sob, his shoulders collapsing. He watched the primary screen. The chunk of hull drifted closer. 6 minutes. 3, 1. It touched the yellow line. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body tensing, instinctively bracing for the blinding white flash of the railguns. He waited for the deafening system-wide alarm that would signal the end of those 3 fading heartbeats. He dug his fingernails into his palms until the skin nearly broke. Nothing happened. The low, rattling hum of the outpost continued uninterrupted. Gideon opened one eye, then the other. The scrap of metal floated cleanly across the demarcation line, tumbling slowly into human space, completely ignored by the slumbering leviathans of the Aegis grid. Gideon let out a short, wet laugh that scraped against his dry throat. He had beaten it. He had committed high treason. And he had won. But the victory soured almost instantly, settling like a cold stone in his gut. They were safe from the kinetic bombardment, yes, but they were still freezing to death in a failing bubble of atmosphere, millions of miles from the nearest human settlement. The Aegis grid wouldn't kill them, but the vacuum of space certainly would. He stared at the console, his eyes bloodshot and burning. He had one card left to play. He couldn't call Earth Command. They would see the script, see the survivors, and manually fire the grid. He had to look outward. Gideon recalibrated his primary communications dish, aiming it away from the Sol system, pointing it deep into the Meridian corridor. It was a lawless, neutral expanse of space, a dense navigational hazard heavily trafficked by smugglers, pirates, and deep space scavengers. Scum. He tuned the transmitter to the galactic standard distress frequency, but he knew nobody out there risked their necks out of the goodness of their hearts. If he pleaded for their lives, he'd be ignored. He had to speak their language. He keyed the microphone, deliberately keeping his voice flat and robotic. Automated distress beacon, Gideon lied, staring at the dust motes dancing in the dim light of his monitor. Kandarian military wreckage located at coordinates J9, immediately trailing the Sol system border. Vessel is crippled, but contains intact internal compartments. High salvage value. Premium hegemony, alloys and tech. No human military presence in sector. Repeat, No human military presence. Safe to approach for extraction. First come, first served. He attached the precise spoofed telemetry data of the drifting hull and slammed his hand down on the transmit button. The tight beam fired, an invisible pulse of desperate hope shooting out into the uncaring black. Gideon didn't know if anyone was listening. He didn't know if a scavenger crew would actually risk edging so close to the human border, even with the promise of high-grade salvage. He didn't know if they would arrive before that violet shield finally died, but he had done it. He sat back, peeling his sweaty hands off the console. They were trembling with a violent, rhythmic intensity. The adrenaline that had carried him through the hack was crashing hard, leaving his muscles feeling like hollow, brittle glass. He was suddenly freezing. He wrapped his arms tightly around his chest, his teeth chattering audibly in the quiet room. He looked at the 3 faint green pulses on his screen. Still beating. Still fighting. He reached into his chest pocket, his shaking fingers struggling with the crumpled cardboard of his nicotine patches. He managed to pry the final patch loose, clumsily tearing the plastic backing with his teeth, and slapped it hard against the side of his neck. The chemical bite offered a tiny, grounding sting against the overwhelming numbness. Gideon looked down at his trembling hands. Ordinary hands, smudged with dust, cuticles chewed raw. They had just authorized a massacre. They had wiped out 50,000 souls with the push of a worn plastic button. And then those same hands had risked execution to give 3 terrified aliens a fraction of a chance at survival. He didn't feel like a savior. He didn't feel like a monster. He just felt exhausted. His eyes drifted to the secondary monitor. The Form 88B was still waiting, the cursor blinking patiently in the empty box. Summary of threat neutralization. Gideon pulled the keyboard toward him, the keys sticky beneath his fingers. He typed 3 neat, bureaucratic words. Target completely destroyed. He hit submit. He dragged his broken chair around to face the reinforced plasteel viewport, staring out into the infinite, starry graveyard of the Oort cloud, and waited for his shift to end. The universe is a dark, cold place, but the most terrifying monsters don't roar, they just wait silently in the void. If you enjoyed this dark, grounded dive into humanity's brutal defense of the Sol system, please hit that like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Don't forget to subscribe for more gritty, immersive HFY stories where the line between survival and monstrosity is razor thin. See you in the next transmission.